much for the invitation. If this debate were that Iran is a destabilising force, I would be happy to participate in it, and I would agree that Iran is a destabilising force. We're talking, however, about Israel, and that is what I want to focus on. Its very formation, setting up a Jewish national home in Palestine in the aftermath of the devastation of the Second World War, and indeed the Holocaust, was, for Jews, an expression of Jewish nationalism and liberation. But for those on whom it was imposed, it felt like a colonial occupation. Brian Klug, an expert writer, philosopher, has said that Zionism is Janus-faced. It faces both ways. It is both liberatory and it is also got an oppressive factor. And I will be arguing that it is the oppressive factor that is now the dominant reality of Israeli society in relation to the Palestinians. We should not be surprised that in 1947 the Palestinians objected to a UN partition recommendation which proposed to give away 55% of their country to form a Jewish state. During a bitter conflict that ensued, something like 750,000 Palestinians were displaced from their homes, towns and villages, about 80% of the Palestinian population. After the war, Israel, having been allocated 55% of mandate, Palestine controlled 78%. Of course, people are displaced in wars, often in huge numbers. Two aspects of the Palestinian displacement stand out. We now know, confirmed by Israeli historians when the archives were opened in the 80s and 90s, that there was a commitment of Jewish leaders to encourage as many Arabs as possible to leave from the territories they hoped to control. There was also a further commitment not to allow them to return. In defiance of Article 13.2 of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights passed in that very same year, and which Israel subscribes to, which states simply that everyone has a right to leave their country and a right to return. It was also in defiance of UN Resolution 194, which allowed for the return of the refugees or compensation for those choosing not to return. Instead, one day after that United Nations resolution was adopted, the Israeli cabinet passed its emergency regulation relative to property of absentees, confiscating all property of the absent refugees, even if they were living elsewhere in Israel. And they were not given any compensation and still not allowed the right to return. The Zionist project was massively destabilizing. I don't think anyone should be surprised at this, but successive Israeli governments have had a choice of making a concerted effort to acknowledge the costs which its foundation had imposed on the region and to seek ways of mitigating its effects. I'm of course aware the Arab states refused to recognize Israel after the war immediately. No conflict is one-sided. But Israel has adopted a stance. Its big chance came in 1967 when it occupied the West Bank and Gaza. It could then have worked for a peace in the region by giving up land for peace, instead of which it has systematically colonized roughly half of the West Bank, which is now under Israeli control, and which is incorporated de facto into Israel. You drive from Tel Aviv to Ariel, you do not know you are not in the same country. Yet Israel is a country with borders, the green line borders. You go to Israel and try to buy a map showing those borders, which I have done. It is very, very difficult to find one. It is not taught in the schools. You speak to young Israelis, they do not know that there is an Israel up to the 67 borders.
On that point, my children in Israeli schools, and that's not true.
Unfortunately, it is. And when the Education Minister under Olmert tried to introduce green line maps into schools, it was not carried through. Sorry about that.
I'll bring the textbook.
Please do. It is very rare to find one.
Main Street
Okay. All right. Now, what happens now? If there is there a two-state solution has been the objective since 1967, 73 onwards, really, when it came onto the agenda. Less and less is there a possibility of a viable second Palestinian state. Less and less is there West Bank territory left that can form a unified state, and less is there any willingness among the Israeli government to contemplate a Palestinian state. Netanyahu is on record saying it will not happen. If there is not a Palestinian state, there will be one state between the Mediterranean and the Jordan, and it is either a state in which everyone is an equal citizen, or it will be an apartheid state. Many people have been calling it that, many in Israel call it that already. That is the choice. And the Israeli government has had choices. This is not demonizing Israel. It is saying that it has made choices along the way that have led to the current situation, the destabilization we've witnessed. And instead of the rosy picture, which was painted of how good life is in Israel, what about the reality in Gaza? A brief word on that. Haaretz, left-wing, no doubt about it, brave, under considerable pressure, has said this: there is no justification for the closure of Gaza. It hasn't prevented missiles from being fired at Israel. It hasn't caused the hopeful public uprising against the Hamas government. It constitutes an incubator for the development of despair and cycles of violence that have made the lives of residents of southern Israel intolerable. That was a couple of weeks ago. It went on to say it regards Gaza. This is an Israeli leading newspaper, editorial. It regards what's happening there as a frightening human experiment, as if someone were trying to study how long people can survive when they're isolated from the world, their cultural environment, and any economic or national horizon. The International Committee of the Red Cross, that closure constitutes a collective punishment imposed in clear violation of Israel's obligations under international humanitarian law. If this isn't destabilizing, I do not understand the meaning of the word. Not the only destabilizing force in the Middle East. The destabilization of the Middle East, I would add to that the invasion by the West of Iraq and the destruction wreaked there, and the destruction wreaked in Libya, which has led to a far more unstable Middle East. Iran, I have no time for the Iranian regime, but they are faced with an Israeli government which has 200 nuclear weapons. If I were in Iran, I would be bloody scared. I would be wanting either to construct weapons for myself or to get an arrangement for a nuclear-free Middle East. That is what Israel should be working for. That is what would bring some stability to a highly unstable region. What about Jerusalem? Recently recognized by Trump, moving the embassy there. Jerusalem is the place of supreme importance to three world religions. It is the place where Christ was crucified. It is where Muhammad ascended to heaven. It is also where the first and second Jewish temples were built. There are plans afoot in Israel by religious fundamentalists for building the third temple on Temple Mount, Haram Kesharif, by destroying the Dome of the Rock and the Al-Aqsa Mosque. I can think of nothing more destabilizing. And if you think this is fringe stuff, the US ambassador 2 weeks ago is photographed with a huge picture, a publicity stunt, a huge picture of Jerusalem with Temple Mount on which the third temple is built. And he is smiling and welcoming this. That alone sends a message of destabilization throughout large regions of the Middle East and the Muslim world. What are the effects of all this worldwide? There's no single Jewish community. We're very fragmented, Orthodox, secular, huge varieties of religious divisions and so on. But with a liberal tradition, most Jews in America voted for Obama. The biblical injunction, justice shall ye pursue, is taken very seriously by large numbers of Jews I know. But what we see emerging in Britain is a view that you have to support Israel, right or wrong, that Israel is your homeland. Olmert invades the Lebanon on behalf of all Jews. Netanyahu goes to France and tells Jews there they've got to go and live in Israel. That is destabilizing Jewish communities. That is dividing them. That is separating them. It is also feeding into a narrative about anti-Semitism. Anti-Semitism used to be clear, and of course we're totally opposed to it. It's a form of racism, hatred, hostility, discrimination or prejudice against Jews because they are Jews. It should be clear, but no. Now we have definitions which say anti-Semitism is increasingly about criticism of Israel which goes too far. It's being unreasonable if you criticize Israel with a perspective of hatred of Jews. That's anti-Semitic. If you criticize Israel for what it has done, what it is doing, 128 people killed in Gaza since the end of March, with sniper fire, not water cannon, not rubber bullets, not tear gas, not smoke bombs, sniper fire, over 13,000 wounded. How many what was the real threat? How many Israeli casualties have you heard of in the news? I haven't heard of one. 128 murdered. Some may have been members of Hamas. I don't doubt it. So what? Members of Hamas is not the right of the duty. It doesn't carry with it the right of the duty to be executed. Israel is destabilizing the Jewish community in Britain, in America, and elsewhere, and we've been asked to give our loyalties either to Israel or to what I regard as traditional Jewish values of justice, humanity, mutual recognition, and respect for the other. I beg to move.